Super excited to be back here again with Miles Austin this time. Yeah, different locations. We just had a great session today in real life, actually, in Basel together, in in a city together on this planet in a country. So it was really nice to meet in person and spend some quality time in addition to having hung out together at SmartCon. So and yeah, so much so we hit it off right away, and that we're actually partnering together with Truflation and Hyphen. But before we get into that, maybe let's just talk about sort of, Miles and Miles Austin, your background, how you got into crypto. You're quite an entrepreneur already in your own being. So yeah, I'd love to find out more about yourself and some background, and maybe share that with the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thanks for having me on here today. Super excited to be here. And it was great seeing you. It's we definitely had some really quality time together at SmartCon
Yeah.
as well as in Switzerland. So that's great. So how did I get into crypto? It's a little bit of a funny story. It just happened really organically. I was going to this. I was on scholarship to this private boarding school called Wasatch Academy, and we had students from all over the world. And in the evenings, they would really start to block a lot of stuff on the internet because they didn't want all these high school kids just staying up all night on their computers, right? And that's where one of my roommates, this really awesome kid from China, was fascinated with Tor browser and all of these different things. And that's how I first discovered it. And I came across Bitcoin and I went, oh, this is really interesting. Okay, it just caught my attention. It was something new, it was something exciting. And so I started to play around with it. And in our free time, we were doing quite a bit of trading. And we just thought it was a really fun thing. Get a couple of the friends together in the dorms and trade some Bitcoin. So it was quite exciting at the time. And then later, when Ethereum came about, that was a bit more exciting because I said, oh, hey, this is something that actually leads towards building. And this has a little bit more use. And in my eyes, there's just a little bit more practical. So that's how I got into it, and always kind of played around with it. When I was younger, I went through some phases where I was more active in crypto, and then other times when I wasn't. But all in all, it's just been a very organic journey since I was young.
Let's learn about, so how you got, sort of after you graduated, I mean, and then what did you do? And then how did you get into Hyphen? And
Yeah.
So I think Hyphen's a year old, right?
Yeah, it's just over a year old. So a bit of a long story. I graduated school when I was really young, was completely finished with school when I was 15. And just I really had this entrepreneur mindset of like, oh, I want to create something and move forward. And so it came to one of my best friends at the time. She really encouraged me that, hey, let's start some companies together and let's do something. So we ended up starting. We kind of teamed up with a few other friends as well and started some music festivals that surprisingly went really well. And so we did a couple music festivals for a few years. It was sort of this dream situation to be in when you're young and you can actually be building and developing a company, but also just having so much fun at the same time. Through that, we started to make a lot of friends in the music industry, and
What were some of the
similarly,
bands you had at your? What were some of the bands you had at your music
I
festivals?
think
Do
that
we know any of them? Or
yeah, the one that I was the most excited that we ever booked was definitely Nas and Lauryn Hill. Lauryn Hill was always someone I really was a big fan of. So to have her actually come and perform at our festival was awesome, just because that doesn't happen every day. So that was definitely my favorite one. Um, but yeah, so we ended up
nice.
making quite a few friends in the entertainment space and just sort of came across one of these problems, right? Everyone was
Yeah.
unhappy. So we said, hey, there's another opportunity here. So we started a record label, and that eventually brought me to Los Angeles. And I lived in Los Angeles for several years, and really had a great time doing that. All this time, I'm still playing around with crypto in my free time and having fun. But I did sort of start to fall a little bit out of crypto, right? Just because it's, how many things can you really juggle at once? I remember that it came down to this simple principle to me that some of the technology I was such an advocate for and so had so much fun with. But, I'm a very realistic person. And I remember, I think it was in 2016 or so, I just had this thought of, in some of this technology, I can actually poke more holes in it than really being an advocate for it. And I knew that it was still something that was developing and growing, and more solutions would come into play. But I will give a big credit to Chainlink. When I read Chainlink's white paper in 2017, um, I really just the vision caught me, and I really thought to myself, wow, okay, this can actually be the solution for some of those holes that I was poking when it comes around interoperability and security and various other things that they really laid out in the white paper. So that kind of drew me much more into it. It actually then led to me finally slowly starting to step out of entertainment a little bit, and focusing more on crypto again. So with my co-founder at Hyphen as well, we ended up launching a fund in the US called CPG Capital, really just focused on the infrastructure, right? Tokenized infrastructure, and trying to find the technologies that aren't necessarily out there to disrupt, but rather to upgrade and make systems more efficient, and being able to work with legacy systems. And how do we build, actually connect this bridge between DeFi and your traditional financial system? So Chainlink fit into that pretty well, as well as a couple other projects. So we launched this fund. I had a great time. Ended up having a lot of our friends in the music space in LA sort of come in and help us get that fund going in terms of limited partners. So it was really just a great experience to see these two worlds collide with each other. And then shortly after, two years later or something like that, COVID hit, and then there was not a lot that right. It kind of just it put a huge pause on anything we had going on in the entertainment space. So I had this reflection with myself of, hey, this has been super fun. It was great when I was young, but maybe I can kind of start to steer into something that I have a bit of a longer term vision with, and that's sort of in the tech space and the financial space, and being able to like build. And it's so early that I just got to move on this, right? So during COVID, everyone was stuck at home. I was one of those really fortunate people, with having a couple different passports, to be able to bounce around still. So everyone was kind of locked up at home, and I was going through the airports. They were empty, bouncing back and forth between Europe and the US, and really just happened to be at a couple places at the right time, and got to know some really interesting people in the banking world, and really was sort of encouraged to move on some of the ideas I had on using these technologies to really combine them with my care for the climate, and say, hey, what can we use here to actually make some of these systems more efficient and address some of these problems? And so that's officially when I sort of checked out of the entertainment space, became a silent owner. Which right at that time too, it was a little bit torn, because one of my partners there, they were just launching this new festival focused on climate, and hey, how can we use our influence in these entertainment communities that do have such a strong influence, and how can we use this influence to actually um, get some of the youth and other people to wake up and to care a little bit more about, hey, the newest Kanye whatever sneaker is cool, but what does that do for us actually, right? And in my personal opinion, it's not doing anything really good for the world. And so how can we actually use some influence to get people to pay more attention to the climate, and something that affects everybody in their real life? And I think that these effects that it will have on people is so much closer than a lot of people are willing to really think and accept. And so, yeah, with all this kind of randomness bouncing back and forth and coming together, I just made the decision, okay, it's time to get out of LA, move to Switzerland, and just dedicate all my time to climate, and how can we use the best toolkits and technologies out of the Web3 ecosystems to improve some of the traditional mechanisms for kind of greening the financial system.
Interesting, because in a way, I set off very similar to you. I set off with the mind in how can we tokenize the planet? What would that look like? How do we build a token economy where we can monetize or even put quantifiable appreciation for certain aspects in life that we feel we need? Then on the flip side, I just found it was so difficult, right? The existing systems in place, the legacy models. We needed a new system with new tools, right? And
And ultimately, if those new systems and new tools could get significant critical mass, we would then be able to bring across some of the old models or the old participants and the legacy participants to sort of, oh wow, this is a great tool, this is going to really help me move my mission forward, and then take out the ego driven elements in there, or the political incentives, and just really put it back to, where's your mission, what are you trying to do, and how can we help make that happen. But I found the funny thing is that you sort of were an operator, an entrepreneur, building a business, got into investments, right, and sort of looked at that, but then realized sort of afterwards again that you wanted to go back into building and really making an impact and actually having, versus just providing the capital and the resources to do so. Was that how did that urge manifest itself, and what was it? Just you were traveling around and you just felt, oh man, I'm rudderless, I'm just doing something boring on a spreadsheet, or what was it that really sort of gave you that the genesis to really, or the inspiration to go back into building again?
Yeah, so some of it actually does have to do with that, this traveling around. And every time I'm traveling, I've always got my headphones in, I'm always listening to music. And I find these times to be a time where I get a lot of inspiration actually, and start to really envision a lot of things, sitting in the airports waiting or on a flight, my mind's always turning, right? And so, yeah, it was super exciting doing a lot of this on the more investment side of things. But we
Yeah.
positioned ourselves pretty well in a couple projects that we wanted to really position ourselves in. And then the market started having more volatility. And that's when I started to learn more and more about some of the problems in this movement of greening the financial system, right? And that's really where I was really picking it apart and comparing it to a little bit of the 2008 financial crisis. So like The Big Short is one of my favorite movies of all time.
Yeah.
It's so good. And so I started to really kind of compare these two scenarios. I said, hey,
Actually, just sorry to interrupt, but
yeah,
that's usually a question I start off with. What's your favorite movie, right? And so then we got it. You covered it without me having to ask you, which is even better.
yeah, exactly. It's so good. But so I started thinking and kind of, just comparing this and on a very oversimplified basis. But sometimes I think it's healthy to do that, just completely oversimplify things. And looking at 2008, you had these great financial products and standards and things being built, but that foundation level was faulty, right? And there wasn't the due diligence that needed to be done. There was no dynamic aspect, no validation or verification on some of these people, right? Why are we giving a dancer in Florida, enough money to buy 5 houses? That's probably not going to end well, right? But so anyway, then looking at these major changes in the monetary system, I started to actually worry and started to talk with some mentors and colleagues and other people and say, hey, look, with all of this change that's coming into place to incentivize green behavior and to require these climate disclosures and to increase the accuracy of like a carbon footprint, these things, where's the data, that foundation level again? Where's one, the technical infrastructure to support this? And two, where's the data, right? Because an elephant in the room a lot of times is that there's a lot of climate data out there, but there's not a lot of quality climate data out there. And so I said, well, what are the chances? We have all this capital pledged and all of these big things happening, but if we don't have that foundation in place, what are the chances we're walking ourselves into another 2008 situation, but we're just have a big green ribbon around it this time? So I know I'm giving you a long answer here, but that's what really inspired me to actually like get up off my ass and just move, because I just happened to be at the right place at the right time, surrounded by the right people, and really just came to this realization that someone's got to do this. And I think it's difficult to see this unless you're sort of in the right place at the right time. And I saw it so clearly that my partner at CPG and I, we just said, hey, let's just do this. Someone's got to do it. We've got a lot of the right contacts in a lot of the right rooms and in the right circles. We can sit here and wait for someone else to do it and try to invest in that, or we can just get up and do it ourselves. And I think that might be a lot more fun because I like a good adventure. So it really just came down to saying like, hey, it's got to be done. Let's give it a shot.
And I think you did give it a shot, right? You've been at it now for a year, and I think you've had a lot of challenges, right? It hasn't been as easy maybe as you set your mind out to do it. But I mean, if it were easy, everybody would be doing it, right? And I suppose that's why you set your heart and mind to do it, which I like a lot. And I think one of the things that when I work with you, at least I always hear you mention, right? It's got to be verified, validated, accurate, right? Those are the three words you use a lot, right? In the data. Why has it been so difficult from governmental institutions and scientific laboratories that are all, funded with taxpayers' money? Why has it been so difficult to access that data and then help get it verified and validated and distributed?
Yeah, so it's when it comes to climate data, I really put it into two different baskets. In one, there's all of this climate data that's collected and basically created from different atmospheric agencies in the world, which are for the purpose of research, which is so important to understand that these were designed for research and to have insights and understanding on a global and some regional levels of what's happening in the atmosphere and what's going on with the climate. On the other side, there's the corporate data, right? And so those two are very different. What I found in sort of the atmospheric side within these different agencies, they've been a pleasure to work with. I'll never forget the director of one of these agencies. When I told him, one of our first meetings, this is what we want to do, this is why we need to do it, and this is where the demand of this information is and why it's so important. I'll never forget. He said in this charming voice, like, "Ha, I've been waiting for you for 30 years. We've always wanted to do stuff with this data, but no one's cared." Which was a shock for me to hear that, right?
Nice.
And so
exactly. Why it's taking so long?
Yeah, exactly. And so it's, but again, we didn't have the demand for this information years ago. And so what I found is working with these different atmospheric agencies has been a really wonderful and a very insightful experience where I've learned a lot as well. And really the thing that's made anything difficult there is sort of twofold. One being a lot of this data are in silos and they haven't actually had the funding that you might expect to be able to put more technical infrastructure in place to improve those systems and make them more efficient. And on the other hand of it, some of it's old, right? And the historic climate data is really important, especially for forecasting and for things more associated to the climate risk. But some of this is, again, still on paper, right? And so getting all of this older data from 30 plus years ago and digitizing it is a whole nother process, right? It's almost like you need another group in the private sector just to focus and do that so you can do that quicker. But all in all, we've now really started to work with these different groups to sort of eliminate the silos and be able to make internal systems more efficient for sharing this data and putting it in preferred formats and, making this more accessible to everybody else and unlocking the power of that data to actually get it to the private sector. On the other side, though, which is, again, important to keep them different, in my personal opinion, the corporate data, right? So that's really where there's a lot of talk and emphasis around ESG. And as we were just talking about the other night with some friends in Switzerland, this ESG term is basically broken now, right? Like, whoa, yeah, especially, it was birthed out of the US, but now it's the US that's really kind of like against ESG. And ultimately, I think it just goes to show that we need something new, right? But the problem within the corporate data comes down to something I think of a little bit more from a philosophical approach, where we just can't trust a lot of people, right? That's the unfortunate part, where if you're a large corporation and you're acting for the best interest of your shareholders and you are going to do better by saying, I have a green shirt, you're going to say you have a green shirt every time, right? That's just the reality of the world. And so that's what happened, right? That was this whole huge explosion of greenwashing, was that there wasn't the proper due diligence and validation verification taking place. So you could just say, oh, I'm this green or I'm this dirty, and that, that's what it was. So ultimately, I would say that the problem within the corporate climate data is just the self-reporting has failed. I don't think it works. I'm, much more in favor of machine-to-machine connections, and that's where the last obstacle that I'll say in this answer, in this long answer, is that when it comes to the corporate world, there's a major lack of physical infrastructure in place to be able to more accurately measure and monitor what the emissions footprints are on facilities and supply chains. There's just a major lack of physical infrastructure in place with very specific IoT, right? You can't just buy a really cheap sensor and say, oh, it's the numbers going up or down. There's much more of a scientific process that goes behind that.
But what amazes me is that in the corporate world and in this whole, we talked about it at length around ESG, is that it's become down to who can pay the most to consultants, to auditors, to accountants, to quantify and put together 300-page reports that really nobody reads. And 9 times out of 10, they're all printed out on a book that sits on a coffee table somewhere, which is, again, printed out, maybe on recycling paper, though. Man, that's okay then. but yeah, sort of joking aside, I think, how do we get, and that's why I love what you're doing, right? Is really, how do we get it to a cryptographically verifiable, that when I put out a green bond, what does a green bond mean, first of all? And then when I put out a green bond, that there are accountabilities towards those to the corporation, right? All these corporations have CEOs, they make these commitments. By 2030, we'll be carbon neutral. But by 2030, he's no longer the CEO, right? That's 7 years down the road. He's most probably been in that role for 5 years. So is he really going to last through that period of time? If he's a founder, maybe. If he's not, less likely, shareholders might vote him out or whatever it is. And so it doesn't really matter. It's non-quantifiable. But if they do take out a green bond and there are commitments in there, how do we hold them accountable to those? How do they then ultimately it's financially? And I don't need a corrupt auditor or a corrupt accountant or, going in there and saying, oh yeah, they're good, but okay, because they paid me $1 gazillion. Of course they're good, right? I mean, what am I going to do? Say they're bad? How do we get to that? And
I mean, I think it's a bit of a conflict of interest, right? If you're,
yeah,
which I understand. If you're in a position where you're getting paid a lot of money to tell somebody how green or dirty of their footprint there is, you're probably going to leave.
Yeah, we just saying that, right? I mean, it's
exactly. So it's definitely ironic, right? But I think one of the things that really will help improve that is, one, having more physical infrastructure in the world to increase the granularity of us being able to measure different, like mainly within greenhouse gases concentrations, because it's so important to have baselines and be able to measure the GHG fluxes so that you can actually begin to have something to use as a backdrop to compare corporate footprints against, right? And if you don't have that backdrop to compare against, then how would you ever know? It's, again, to oversimplify something, how would you actually know how accurate a corporate footprint is if you don't have the ability to reference what's actually happening in the atmosphere? So that's a lot of something. Some of the work that we focus on heavily at Hyphen is actually providing that insight. But ultimately, I think that the thing that will change this the most, and I know this gets a little bit controversial depending on who you ask, but I think the monetary system can do this. So by putting the right incentives in place to make it more profitable to be able to prove how green your footprint is versus how dirty it is, will incentivize people, right? And talking about, or we were kind of alluding to some of the potential, whether it's intentional or unintentional corruption that takes place around some corporate footprints. Well, it's because of that incentive, right? Humanity loves to lean towards where they're incentivized to go. So if the monetary system can now incentivize you to prove how green your footprint is or how green your portfolio is for an asset manager, you're going to lean that way, right? The incentive is in place now. And I'm really excited to see how things unfold over the next few years, because at least for Switzerland and for Europe, those incentives are now coming into place. So there's a lot of changes that come into effect at the beginning of next year, 2023. And then another round of these incentives that becomes a little bit more mandated in 2025 and 2026. So I'm excited to see that we are heading in that direction for these incentives to be put in place. But again, it becomes very political at that point, right? And I'm not a guy that loves to dive deep into politics, but it's easier from what I've found for some of these decisions to be made and take place in places such as Switzerland and in the EU, versus, not to point fingers, but in the United States, I think it's much more difficult for that to happen efficiently or with any amount of speed, because if the Fed wants to do something, they can't just boom, we're doing it, right? They have to actually go through certain processes and get the political approvals that are necessary to be able to do these sort of things. And that's opening up a whole can of worms, right? And so it's interesting to see what places in the world are doing the most, the quickest, and what the outcome of that will be in the next couple of years.
Can you share what some of those examples are going to be? What are the incentives? Right? I mean, I'm a capitalist, right? I really believe in sort of, and the freer the markets, the more the market will define what is right and wrong, and consumers will make a decision. And so ultimately, as a capitalist, where there are incentives, I will then take that into account and look at the opportunities associated with that. Where do you see these incentives, and what can you give an example or two of what Europe and Switzerland are, how they're incentivizing the sort of go green or impact activities or circular economy?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a great example is what's called CBAM, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. This is supposed to go into effect in 2023. But what it is it's essentially, it's a carbon border around the EU. So as an example for you, let's say I'm a lithium miner producer in Chile, and I want to export out of Chile and import into Germany for their auto industry, right? You're now going to have to prove that emission footprint. And if you can't, there are penalties, right? So you'll begin to get fined for not being able to prove that emission footprint associated to that underlying asset, right? Mainly focused on commodities, steel, heavy industry, and oil and gas.
But isn't that's more a penalty? So they're enforcing a tax on an emerging market that is already dependent on the European loans to denominate in US dollar. So where's the incentive there? Is there not an incentive that the government will subsidize your price per lithium? That would be super good, right?
Yeah, that would be ideal, right? And that's where I think that there still needs a level of clarity and understanding to come into place around that. But I'm the type of person, maybe it's a little bit more of like a sinister approach, but I'm like, hey, if it's a penalty, like for me, I'm like, whatever, it's still pushing in the right direction. And so with that, in my way, and it's not directly a financial incentive, but I think it's still incentivizing you to have a greener footprint. Because if your competition in Argentina or somewhere, wherever it is in the world, right? If they don't have as green of a footprint for you, they're not going to have the level of business as you. So you can get that upper hand by just cleaning up your own facilities and making those more climate friendly, or the best that you can, right? Depending on what vertical it's in. But it puts a competitive landscape on there to be more green. And I think that we will see people do that as business is very competitive. And so I think CBAM is like a great first step. But again, this is supposed to go into effect next year, but it's not fully mandated until supposedly around 2025, 2026. So that'll be really interesting to see.
Interesting, yeah. I mean, I do find it a bit, those type of incentive structures, I find a bit, sort of, what's the right word? I don't know. It's sort of not quite aligned, right? So what I think because the burden on ensuring that I am more green is done to a developing market, which generally doesn't have the funding, doesn't have the resources necessarily to do that, but they have the resources. Yeah. So they then have to invest more. How do they invest more? Oh, I have to get a loan to do that investment so I can comply and ship it to a Western market. Okay, so where do I get the loan? Oh, I get the loan from a bank which is tied to the IMF, which is US dollar denominated. So then again, I'm beholden to an external party that is not necessarily, I'm not, and so rather than that, wouldn't it be better if we could try and turn it around and say, look, if you import German manufacturer, if you import from green sources, we will give you a tax credit of XYZ if they can prove that they're from a green source. So then the German guy, I'm an importer, I'm the buyer. I then add that into my buying and change my habits from the purchasing decision because there's a financial incentive to do so.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And I think that's some of the vision in place there, right? To actually get towards a system like that. Something that is a personal thought of mine. So this is not anything official in any terms of regulation. Going into to sort of your point, your vision there is something I always thought would be really interesting is, once you have, again, this relies heavily though on the accuracy of climate data. But we have the ability now through the different toolkits made available in the Web3 ecosystems and what you're seeing in parallel with all of this experimentation around the central bank digital currencies to really integrate all of this to begin to automate those incentives, right? So what this could potentially look like in the future, and also could not, right? This is just an idea. But, let's say if you're farming's an easy example in agriculture, right? But it could be anything. So don't pick apart this example too much. But let's say you're a farmer and you can now monitor the emissions associated to that location. If your footprint's becoming greener and your emissions are turning down, that can automatically trigger some smart contracts that connect directly with the CBDC network. So if your emissions are coming down, automatically your lines of credit will increase and your interest rates will lower. And then exactly the other way around, there's a penalty as well, right? If your emissions are really increasing, then your lines of credit shrink and potentially get more basis points added on. And so you can have this automated scale in place that says, hey, for those people who are behaving better, we will directly make it in your financial benefit to do so versus if you're not. And that's just like a silly little example, but I think it's potentially somewhere where we could be heading in the future. I'm still sort of mixed myself on this sounds great the way I think of it, but again, it sort of starts to remind me like Frankenstein at that point, right? It gets a little dicey, but so it all to just say I think we're still early and there's a lot of innovation and pieces that will come into play over the coming years.
And I think that's really interesting. I think the model that you highlight is in principle is the great model. And I think that's a way that we should do it. I think rather than coupling it with the CBDC, though, I would then sort of have a look at how do we give it out to the free market, right? And this is a threshold. And every year, the threshold slowly comes down as it relates to specific components. And then you can commercialize if you're putting the money, instead of paying shareholder dividends or doing stock buybacks, you're actually investing in IoT sensors to track more of what you're doing so that you can actually then quantify what the elements are that are below that threshold that gives you the credits that you can then sell in the marketplace. So bad actors can have to go and buy it in the marketplace. But the market then defines what that equilibrium is. And there are going to be benefactors, and supply and demand will stipulate the price.
I couldn't agree more with you. I think it's and I think that's totally realistic, right? We have the right, not just the right toolkits available today, but we have the right startups. We have the right people innovating. We have all the right kind of puzzle pieces here to assemble this and make it a reality. But it's just going to take some time and a lot of collaboration and working together to get it there. Which, as some of the crypto communities love to say, we're all in this together. We're all stronger together. And I really think it couldn't be more true.
Yeah, no, and I think there is so much opportunity, right? There is a whole new market that could be created and an industry as such that could be created if it were done fairly, and then and everybody could participate in it, and it was transparent. Right at the moment, again, the difficulty is it's intransparent, and that's why I love sort of a lot what you're doing is really just making it available and providing the transparency with the data, and that's really what we need, right? And you know um, one of the things that I think is as the blockchain is really heavily sort of tied to Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, and then lately a lot more with DeFi, right? And sort of, I'd love to create DeFi related products associated with the data that we're bringing to market with Truflation, with all of this, economic data. You're bringing the climate data in there. How do we go and build DeFi products? And given the volatility and everything associated with it, how do you think we should go about addressing that? Or, yeah, I mean, have you had some thoughts around that? Or
Yeah, well,
I get asked that a lot.
yeah, it's interesting when it comes to I get asked about the volatility all the time, right? Less from my hype perspective, but more from my funds. But
Yeah.
it's interesting to see kind of the correlations to different things in the world and how that is affecting the volatility in crypto markets. Where in my earlier days in crypto, things were very driven by Bitcoin, right? You had this big dominance. I mean, you still do, but it was mainly controlled and in the hands of a lot of crypto people, who I think not always, but generally these communities kind of have the same vision. They want the number to go up. They want to see this become a really really big thing, right? And they're kind of in it together. I think that's landscape has changed a lot, which comes to human intervention actually. So now you have larger asset managers who have gotten into this space, right? We've seen the overall market cap of the Web3 ecosystem increase a lot over the last 3 years. And so now you have not just a bunch of crypto people playing in this now, right? You've got people from a different mindset with different trading practices and investment theses who are not just holding a bunch of crypto, right? They've got one hand heavily in your traditional system and the other hand now pretty heavily into crypto, mainly into things like Bitcoin and Ethereum, who are still have that dominance, right? And so now, and this is just my thought on it, but I think that if I put myself in those shoes and I'm one of these larger asset managers that has my hand in both, because a lot of the bigger ones still haven't touched crypto yet, but for some of those big firms that have their hand in both, they're now thinking of it from a point of view from them being in both, right? So what they're doing in the traditional world might be affected by the crypto world and vice versa. And so they're moving things around by assessing and judging both things, right? Because you're counting all the eggs in your basket, essentially, right? I think that's the first time this has happened, which I think ultimately is healthy in the long run because it means we're progressing and moving forward. But indirectly, that has made more of a correlation now between your traditional markets and your crypto markets, because you've got people playing in both sides, right, with significant amounts of capital, not just smaller amounts. So that I think doesn't help the volatility, but I think it's will start to iron itself out. You also have just it's a pretty crazy time in the world right now, right? We've got all of these different geopolitical things taking place, these macroeconomics. So it's a volatile time. But maybe it's like the older sort of DeFi person in me that just says, hey, these are the times where I'm not doing lots of trading stuff. This is when you build, just focus on building and dollar cost average. It's not investment advice, but just like, dollar cost average and build and stick in it for the long run. But to tie it into some of your other questions, how can we use some of these toolkits and things to build other like green products and make it more inclusive and things? That's something you and I were brainstorming the other day. Ultimately, I think by doing that and connecting a lot of this to real world assets, especially things in the natural world, right? So a lot of these externalities that are now becoming internalities, by creating the right incentives and cryptographically guaranteeing that these assets are doing what you think they're doing, I think can really start to pull some of the dominance away from things such as Bitcoin or some of these larger asset managers and give the smaller guys more of a chance to be able to be positioned better in some of these projects and different assets that are maybe tied to real world assets or different underlying commodities and things, so that we can start to have a little bit more confidence in this for not just the long term like crypto hopium, but to go, okay, this has actually become something very real in the world now, right? We're now starting to create upgraded versions of older financial products, but we're making newer versions of these using the tools from Web3. And that makes it more inclusive as well, right? And so that's something I'm really excited about, is just seeing how much innovation in that area that's taking place, especially in movements like refi. I think is really doing a good job of that.
Yeah.
But again, I'm still a believer in we're early.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I think we're really early, and there's still so much to do, right? And if I look at most of the systems that are deployed, and particularly in the different governments around the world, we're still heavily dependent on systems and frameworks and policies and processes that were put in place more than 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And that was pre every household having internet, having air conditioning, having heating systems that were centralized, right? Having sanitation systems, right? Today we have sanitation systems, we have electricity, we have iPhones, we have mobile phones, we have electricity, we have all these systems, but we still are reliant on systems that were set up more than 100 years ago, that were layered on top of layered on top of layered on a new process, but only incremental improvements versus leapfrogging.
Yeah, well, I mean that's one of the things I love about what you're doing with
Yeah,
Truflation is
yeah,
changing that, right?
yeah,
It's something where I learned quite a bit from you on the way that the inflation's calculating these different things and how you're going about it so differently and making this not just so much more efficient and accurate, but in near real time, right? Or in some cases in real time. And I think
yeah,
that's super exciting because to your point, some of these systems are really old, right? And
yeah.
I'm personally like I love history. I think history is not just very interesting, but it's very important. And so I really love it. And when you were describing to me some of how outdated the system around calculating inflation is, it reminded me a lot of just kind of like the origin of banking, right? Like where did
Yeah.
reserve fractional banking come from? It's very old. It's hundreds of years old, and it was basically created by some knights in Europe. And they said, "Hey, we've got
Yeah.
this wonderful idea. We'll hold all the gold, give you a note, and we'll hook up some incentives here and interest and things." So why are we still using these systems that are so old in a world that's moving so quickly today with so much innovation? And that's where I think it's I don't have an ultimate answer for that, right? I think it's probably complicated from
Yeah.
different geopolitical incentives and just politics, all sorts of stuff. But ultimately, I think what we're seeing in the economy today is just a loud cry for changing some of these systems, upgrading them, making them more efficient, and actually making them more inclusive, so that we can more people have the ability to actually participate in the economy and not just sort of support it from the bottom up.
Yeah, and so my view is very much like, look, how many people listen to economic data every day, right? There's a handful of people. How many people listen to economic data once a month when the Fed comes out with the inflation data? There's a larger number of people, right? And what we want to do is make sure that amount of people that listen to this data all the time, every time, is as everybody, and we're going to be there holding your hands, championing you through this, and helping you understand what that data means and how it impacts you, right? How does that impact you yourself, right? And that's really what we want to do. And then what can you do about it, right?
Yeah,
And what are the tools you need?
well, that's something I'm really excited about with what you announced at SmartCon, is being able to sort of
Yeah,
have your own personal calculator to what's my inflation, right?
yeah,
My inflation is probably, just as a silly example, is astronomically different than like what my mom's is, right? My mom lives on like a farm in Utah. I live in
Yeah,
Switzerland. Couldn't have different lifestyles. So our inflation is so
yeah.
much different, right? And some of us are affected by that vastly different, right? And so I think it's just so important to be able to have the ability to do that, which I mean, it could be a little bit of a silly thing to say, but until you kind of really have that accurate insight from a personal viewpoint, how it's hard to just generalize, right, with everybody else and say, oh, this is what I can and can't do. You got to understand that to really properly and accurately have your own personal finances in order. So I think it's really great that you'll have the ability to do this with what you're doing at Truflation. It's something I'm really excited about. And it's just something I already know I'm going to be playing around with it and seeing how it works versus one lifestyle compared to another. You name it.
And I think it's to me, it's not only inflation data, but inflation hits everybody personally. But I was in Switzerland and we were talking about what's inflation by industry vertical, right? So to your point, all the lithium, what would, all the lithium, what's the impact of lithium mining from an inflation perspective? We can calculate that. How do we then take the carbon data and make that visually comprehensible so that anybody can understand, here's the checklist, here's the weighting, here's the data that underlies that, and this is how we calculate all the lithium mining, sort of carbon footprint, if you will. But it's then transparent and we can deal with it, because I think we can, as humans, we can deal with most anything except we hate unexpected, implications, right? The fact that we can't predict, we cannot forecast, that is something that we're very uncomfortable with, especially when you have 27 variables that are constantly changing and all the underlying fundamentals don't compute anymore associated with those 27 variables or whatever it is, right? Which I think we are in that world today. And that's the problem we're having.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, right? And it's just it's so interesting to think about too, because when we focus on the data side of things, right? And I'm the most familiar with it when it comes to climate, but I'm sure it's applicable also to various different things in verticals and specific niches and industries. But having this historic data is so important to be able to put predictions and forecasts in place, right? And that's where, at least on the climate side, it's difficult because you have that to, up into a certain amount, and then it's on paper. And we're no longer working in a world where things are on paper. It just doesn't work. So we need to digitize some of that. But it's just so important to have an accurate understanding of clean, pure data, to be able to start to have more accurate predictions and forecasts in place. But then again, the whole thing can get thrown off when a war breaks out. And so that I think that's just part of the world we live in, right? Is we can predict some things with high accuracy versus other things. It's still sort of a joker card in the deck where we're not sure when or why or how, right? But it will show up.
I think that's the angle, right? I mean, there's so many different variables out there, and there's always a joker, and specifically in times of war, times of uncertain energy crisis that we go. Then all of a sudden, those benchmarks or those thresholds that we held ourselves accountable to, they shift, right? They're no longer relevant. But actually, the paradigm has changed, and we still need to hit those same goals. Why should those goals change just because the market's changed? I mean, a lot of businesses go under because the market's changed, because they weren't ready for it. They couldn't adapt. They didn't have the appropriate resources. They never got the funding. They never got the support, and nobody gave them the leeway. Oh, you can extend. You don't need to. Don't need to pay back the loan by such and such a date or whatever, right? And so, how do we hold ourselves accountable to that? Number one, and if not, then how do we have a framework that allows for that change to impact everything, not just one specific element, but everybody and everything, right?
I think, and I don't have an answer for this, right? Because it's such
no, I don't either, but
it's something I personally at least think it will really help get us to that next step, is sort of like the Internet of Things, right? Being able to connect and sync more things together so that you have automated communications between so many of those systems. I think by having a more efficient connectivity in place among all of these different variables that we're talking about, I personally think is the first step in getting in the right direction to really accurately not just mitigate all of this, but to actually be more prepared for it and have the insight to be able to then not just mitigate this, but to really understand, predict, and forecast, and try to figure out if this happens over here, how, is it going to affect X, Y, and Z on this side, right? And just having that ability to really view the global economy as a whole, as well as to kind of get in on the more granular and localized areas, I think is the dream come true, right? And we've got the tools to do it today. It's just now about all of the right people coming together and the right companies and the right groups and the right innovation all working together to get there.
One thing that I'm a big believer in IoT. I built a business. I was the CTO at Energy Box, which was an IoT company, and in that space, one thing that you always get asked is, how do I know that the sensor is not going to be adulterated, that the sensors are not going to be given a fake algorithm, that are not going to be hacked, etc. Right? And but in principle, if everybody's a good actor, it goes and works well, right? But maybe 2% out of the population are going to be bad actors. How do we ensure numbers and are going to be accurate, right?
Yeah, I think when it comes to IoT, a lot of it comes into this security you have in place in your system, but particularly around your like monitoring dashboards and things.
Yep.
So that you can be alerted immediately if there's any sort of anomaly or something happening in the data, right? Having that alerting system in place is vital for this. That being said, it gets a little bit complicated though, right? As an example for you, for some GHG monitoring towers, if someone's smoking a cigarette within a block of the tower, it'll come up. And so you have this. There's someone's job just to be able to detect those sort of anomalies and flag those.
Anomalies.
Right? Yeah. My point being,
so and you must be able to use AI also to use that, flag those anomalies, right? Yeah.
I think so. It's less common in the scientific communities because it just hasn't really been developed. But also, I think that scientists really like to look at that and understand it for themselves. It's a little tricky to do with AI at the moment. So it's important to be able to understand which is someone altering with something versus an actual just anomaly that's taking place. But the last thing that I would add on there is that I think as more and more IoT devices become used and potentially enforced in certain industries, I think it's also going to take someone on the ground to check this out, right? So something like as a little example for you, in the United States, I think I could be totally wrong on this, but I think it's like the FDA or someone comes and inspects your restaurant once a year, right? To make sure that you don't have cockroaches running around in the kitchen and X, Y, and Z, right? So I think the same thing needs to come into place with some of these IoT devices used for climate, right? That you have an unexpected auditor that pops by once a year or a couple times a year just to double check and make sure this is the exact device that you say it is with the same serial number at the right spot and it's connected, nothing's been changed with it, right? We don't want someone to, if there's a device sitting on a smokestack, for them to just, move the device and do that over a slow period of time so it doesn't trigger off any sort of alerting and alarm. So I think there's the need for auditors or people to come and actually check this out and make sure that it is exactly what it is.
But I think what we've learned, and also in the blockchain space, that you can lock timestamp a lot of the data, right? So I can, if I'm installing this sensor, I can lock in the location, the precise location today. You can lock in sort of so that does never gets adulterated. The firmware doesn't get changed, or when the firmware gets changed, etc. So a lot of that data can be locked in, and it can be visible in a block explorer, right? So everybody can see it. So it's then again brings out that transparency element that we talked about earlier, and that to me is the beauty. So instead of mandating, that we have to police 100% of the population, we only need to sort of, make sure that we support and make it as easy and incentivize the 98% of the good actors, and then just clamp down and figure out ways to verify, validate anomalies, then go after the 2% bad actors.
Oh, I couldn't agree more with you. Like that,
Yeah.
that's music to my ears.
Yeah.
The thing that I still try to kind of understand and balance is that you do have some, larger corporations in the world still who just don't want that level of transparency, right?
Volkswagen, wasn't Volkswagen something that didn't comes to
few of
mind?
There's a few of them, right? So there are still a lot
or
of
others too. I mean, I'm sure loads of it.
want this level of
Yeah.
transparency.
Yeah.
But again, if you ask like a 13-year-old version of myself, I'd say, well, they don't want that level of transparency because they're doing something suspicious, right? Not always the case, not always the case. But I think it definitely sets the tone to really what you're just talking about of like, hey, we need to make these systems very transparent so that, we don't have to have some Frankenstein machine that's, policing everybody, but instead we put the right incentives in place to let the people police themselves, because if you act better, it's better for everybody, and it makes more financial sense for yourselves. And for that smaller group of players who are not behaving well, at least everybody knows it's you now, right? So you can start to have that level of accountability. We'll see though.
Yeah, we'll see though. I mean, I think we've got a long way to go, but there is a huge opportunity. And this is why we are both, I think, at least for me, at least for 100% sure, super excited. This is the time to be alive. This is the time to interpret the data. This is the time to seek out that transparency, to identify what the patterns are, to build systems that set out the alerts. There is so much to be done, to communicate those, to package those, to make it comprehensible, to educate on how to use that. There are so many opportunities alive in this new world that allows, if we educate and transform the population towards the friendly, the opportunity, the monetization capabilities, the wealth that's going to be created around this. It's that's why I'm super excited, and that's why I think,
I can't agree more. Like there's so much opportunity right now. It's really exciting, and that's what's so wonderful when you and I really hit it off, and the Hyphen and Truflation started to work together. We view this so similarly, right? But there's something I definitely would encourage to other people out there right now is these opportunities a lot of the time start with the vision that someone has, and that vision can only manifest itself as an opportunity if you move on it, right? And a lot of the times, if you don't, someone else will. But that's not to discourage yourself and say, "Oh, then I won't do it." So what I'm really saying here is, for a lot of the people who are interested in this space and excited about it and eager to want to be involved, I would just strongly encourage people just do it. Just get up and go for it. These communities are very collaborative. People like to work with each other. Just get up off your ass, move, and start walking that path. And I promise you'll either learn a lot from it or some really good things will come out of it, and both.
Yeah. And I can tell you, we all need talent, right? There is a dire need of talent in this space and across this area. So everybody's new. You're starting off with the same level field, right? It's an opportunity for everybody. And once you get in, if you immerse yourself into this, you will definitely, you're always learning, intellectually super stimulating and gratifying, because you can have such an impact as we're so early in this evolution. So super excited. Thank you so much, Miles. I've taken up more than enough of your time. I know we're all really busy and got lots going on, but Yeah, always fun talking to you. How
Yes.
can people follow you, find out more about Hyphen? Where do they go, and where can they keep up to date on what you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can check out our Twitter. The Hyphen Twitter is just hyphen_AG. That's where we're active the most. Our website is just www.hyphen.earth. And between those two things, you should be able to stay up to speed on everything we're doing, as well as on our LinkedIn. And that's basically where you can find us and see what we have coming. Between our work with you, we have some exciting announcements coming up, as well as just throughout the rest of this year. We're really looking forward to sharing a lot more of what we've been working on and different things coming to market.
Yeah, no, and I had the privilege to have a little peek under the hood of terms of some of the little things that bigger things that you're working on, and yeah, so I'm excited to learn more as they come to fruition, and I look forward to working with you and seeing how we can convert some of what we're working on together into commercialized opportunities for everybody.
Yeah, for everybody. And that's the key, for everybody, right? To make it really
Everybody.
inclusive for everybody. Now, Stefan,
And we will champion whoever wants to go into this path. We will champion. We'll be there supporting you any route of the way, whatever you do with us.
Yes, exactly. So that's what I was saying earlier. Just you got the vision, just go for it. Do it. Don't hesitate to reach out. Stefan, always great speaking with you. It was wonderful seeing you the other day. And thank you for having me on here today. It was super exciting.
Thank you. Thank you, Miles. See you.
Absolutely.